Lacole Yang, and I'm a high schooler in California, and I'm going to be talking about Selma Lagerlöf, who was the 1909 winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Next. So some basic information about her is that her full name was Selma Ottilia Lovisa Lagerlöf, and she was born on November 20th, 1858, and she passed away March 16th, 1940, at the age of 81 years old. During her lifetime, Lagerlöf lived on Marbaca Estate, which was the family estate that belonged to her paternal grandmother, Elizabeth Maria Wennervig. So that was the grandmother on her father's side. And Lagerlöf's grandmother had inherited it from her mother. Marbaca Estate was located at Östra Ämtervik in Värmland County, which was near the southern part of Sweden. Next. Lagerlöf's father was Erik Gustav Lagerlöf, and her mother was Elizabeth Lovisa Walrath. Erik Gustav Lagerlöf was a retired army officer, and Walrath was the daughter of a wealthy merchant who owned a mine, and Lagerlöf was one of their multiple children. Next. The reason that Lagerlöf won the Nobel Prize in Literature was in appreciation of the lofty idealism, vivid imagination, and spiritual perception of her writing, which means that her writing had a lot of spiritual elements, and her imagination was very creative and interesting. Her winning of this award was very important because she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, which was a really great accomplishment, and she was also the first person from Sweden. Lagerlöf had a lot of inspirations for her writing, but one of her motivations that came from her youth that helped her to get started writing was her grandmother, who helped raise her and told her a lot of stories and fairy tales when she was young. Another one of Lagerlöf's motivations was reading, since she read a lot of stories and books in her childhood. And one of the books that Lagerlöf was especially inspired by was Osceola by Thomas Mayne Reid. Lagerlöf was also inspired by her governesses, since she was taught by governesses for most of her early education. And as a child, Lagerlöf wrote a lot of poetry as well as a play, but she did not publish these. Next. So for Lagerlöf's actual published writing, this mostly consisted of prose and more specifically novels. Lagerlöf was very inspired by folk tales, legends, and other stories from around her home in Värmland County, Sweden. Her writing depicted a lot of realistic elements and views of people's lives, their circumstances, their ideas, their social interaction during the 19th century. And her writing was known to be very descriptive and attention-capturing and detailed, but also clear to understand. Some of the themes that Lagerlöf included in her writing were romantic themes and stories of moral dilemmas, as well as containing religious and supernatural elements. Next. So now we're going to go over a timeline of her lifetime. As I said earlier, during her youth, Lagerlöf stayed in her family estate, Marbaca, and she left the family estate to go to preparatory school in 1881. Lagerlöf was motivated to go to preparatory school by the writer Anna Friesel, who convinced her to take out a loan to finance her formal education. After graduating preparatory school in a year, Lagerlöf went to study at the Women's Higher Teacher Training College at Stockholm in the years 1883 to 1885. While Lagerlöf was at school, she read many works by famous authors, causing her to question a lot of the traditional Christian beliefs that she held. However, even though Lagerlöf questioned these traditional beliefs, she still kept her faith in God, as well as the goodness and morality of God. And In 1885, after graduating from school, Lagerlöf started working at a girls' secondary school in Landskrona. And toward the right, we can see a picture of the school at which Lagerlöf worked. At this point, Lagerlöf's main source of financial resources was her teaching job, but she also wrote at a side job. And then in 1889, even though it's not shown on this timeline, Lagerlöf's father fell into some financial trouble, and he ended up not being able to pay back his debts. So the Marbacka estate had to be sold, and the Lagerlöf family lost ownership of it. However, in 1890, the year after that, good news came, since Lagerlöf managed to publish her work for the first time. And she did this by winning first place in a competition at a Swedish newspaper that was published every single week. And after winning this competition, Lagerlöf was able to publish excerpts from her first and best work. In 1891, Lagerlöf was able to publish this work in the form of a full-length novel, and it was called Ghosta, Berling, Saga, and other copies of this book is also known as the Saga of Ghosta, Berling, and this was Lagerlöf's debut novel. In 1894, Lagerlöf met Sophie Elkin, who was also a writer, and Lagerlöf and Elkin critiqued each other's work a lot over the years and helped each other with their writing. They had a great deal of correspondence and letters sent between them, and these letters that they wrote actually suggest that Lagerlöf fell in love with Elkin, even though Elkin may not have reciprocated her feelings, since Lagerlöf later gained great success and Elkin could have gotten jealous of that. However, during this time period, they traveled around Europe, and one of the places they went was Italy, which I'll talk about later. And then in 1895, Lagerlöf became more successful in her writing career, and she was able to move to Falun and support herself solely through her writing. She was also able to do this because she received financial support from the royal family, as well as the Swedish Academy, which you might remember from the first video in this series, is the institution that awards the Nobel Prize in Literature. And then in 1897, 2 years later, Lagerlöf published The Miracles of Antichrist. The Miracles of Antichrist is set in Sicily, which is part of Italy, one of the places that she traveled to with Sophie Elkin. And The Miracles of Antichrist talked about the relationship between Christian systems of morality and goodness and socialist systems. Also in 1897, Lagerlöf met Valborg Olander, another one of her close friends, who was a teacher just like Lagerlöf and also a supporter of women's rights. Next. In 1901 to 1902, Jerusalem, also called the Holy City, was published. This book is about Swedish peasants who immigrated to the Holy Land, whom Lagerlöf visited in 1900. This book was an immediate success, and it was also written in 2 parts. In 1906, Lagerlöf continued her publications and writing, and during this year she published The Wonderful Adventures of Nils, one of her more well-known works. It was a lovely children's book, and it was created to be educational material for elementary school students. And then in 1909, as we already know, Lagerlöf won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And in 1910, Lagerlöf was able to use the money she earned from the Nobel Prize in Literature to buy back her family estate, where she was able to live for the rest of her days. Next. And then in 1911, Lagerlöf gave a speech at the International Alliance for Female Suffrage, which is the movement in support of women's rights and women's rights to vote, and this shows that she was a great supporter of the women's suffrage movement. And then in 1914, World War I started. And during this time period, Lagerlöf held very pacifist views, meaning that she supported peace and she was against violence in war. During World War I, Lagerlöf focused more on her work for peace and in support of peace and feminism and women's rights instead of producing more writing. However, in 1922 to 1932, Lagerlöf continued publishing again, and this time she published Marbeca, which was a series of autobiographical books where Lagerlöf talked about her childhood in Marbeca estate. And one of the stories that she described was an incident when she was very, very young where she injured her legs, causing her to be unable to use her legs for 2 entire years. And then in 1925 to 1928, also around this time period, she also published a historical trilogy, which was The Ring of the Lowenfelds. In 1933, Lagerlöf donated one of her works, which was a Christian legend, for publication, and she did this to earn money for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, which Lagerlöf did in Auken's honor. So Lagerlöf was a supporter of the resistance against Nazis, and she also supported getting German intellectuals out of Nazi Germany. And one of the things that Lagerlöf did for this cause was helping the poet Nelly Sachs get a visa, and Sachs also later won a Nobel Prize in Literature, so you might hear about Sachs later. Next. Now I'm just gonna go over some of Lagerlöf's most successful and well-known works. And first of all, I'm going to be talking about Ghosta Berling Sagam. This saga was important since it was her first published and best and most popular work out of everything that she wrote. Its reception was very positive, and its popularity was increased by the Danish translation, which had very wide acclaim and recognition and pushed Gösta Berling's saga on its way for lasting success in Sweden, Denmark, and the rest of the world. Its themes are beauty versus duty, as well as joy versus good. And the content and plot is about the adventures of a minister who stayed at a manor in Ekeby. Next. The second book that I'm going to be talking about is called The Wonderful Adventures of Nils. Its origin was, its original form is a textbook, since it was commissioned by the Swedish National Teachers Society to be a textbook for elementary school students to learn about Swedish geography and Swedish history. However, just because it was a textbook doesn't mean that it was boring, since Lagerlöf made it very interesting with her beautiful and poetic phrases and moral lessons, as well as a very unique main character with the willful spirit of childhood. It was very popular, and as proof of this, it had 5 different film adaptations. One was a Soviet animated movie, another was a Swedish live action film. There was also a 52-episode anime that was broadcasted all across the world, as well as a Swedish and German live action 2-part film adaptation, and a French CGI-based TV show. Just because The Wonderful Adventures of Nils was very popular doesn't mean that it did not face criticism. In fact, some of the criticism against this book was that Lagerlöf did not write the main character stopping in Holland County in Sweden, even though the main character stopped in pretty much all of the other counties in Sweden and learned about facts there. And it also had some scientific inaccuracies. And these criticisms, these critiques and details inspired new revisions of the book to be published. The plot is very interesting, and it's about a young boy called Nils who is initially very cruel at the beginning of the book, and Nils traps a gnome, and in return, the gnome curses Nils and turns him into a gnome himself, causing Nils to be shrunken down into a very small size. After this, Nils continues to fly across the provinces of Sweden on the back of his pet goose. And while Nils does this, he learns about Sweden, but he also learns all sorts of moral lessons and other teachings that helps him to grow up and learn right from wrong. Next. Next. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, is there nothing after that? Okay, it's okay because that's pretty much the end of this presentation. That's all. I hope that you found Lagerlöf interesting, and maybe you can even be inspired by the fantastical perspective of everyday life that was shown in her work. So thank you for listening.